Affirmation is not the goal. Advocacy is.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City.
If LGBTQ plus allyship stops at affirmation within the four walls of the church, we will be missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Because even as we are affirming LGBTQ plus communities within our sacred spaces, they are still under assault in the public square. And that is where the church, those of us who believe ourselves to be believers of Christ and sort of torchbearers for justice, should be stepping up and stepping in.
Reverend Don Abram is the dynamic founder of Pride in the Pews, a nonprofit equipping Black faith leaders with the skill set and knowledge base that they need to advocate for the LGBT community within and outside of the Black church. As we celebrate Pride Month, it's a great opportunity to get an update on the important work at the intersection of LGBT identity and faith. This week, Don Abram is back with us on The State of Belief. As we keep growing our library of extraordinary interviews, I want to make sure you are subscribed to the State of Belief podcast. Please visit stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You'll hear this episode in full, as well as recent interviews with people such as Rainn Wilson, Dr. Anthea Butler, Rob Reiner, John Pavlovitz, Rabbi Sharon Brous, Bishop William Barber, and many others. It would really help us to have you subscribe, rate, and tell people you're close to all about what you're hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com, and you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest. Reverend Don Abram heard the call to ministry at the age of 14. Years later, on his way to an MDiv at Harvard Divinity School, Don combined his rigorous theological training and a heart for justice to deconstruct homophobic and transphobic theologies from the perspective of Black liberation theology. In 2021, he launched Pride in the Pews, a grassroots, nationwide nonprofit that bridges the gap between the Black church and the LGBTQ communities through storytelling, political education, and civic engagement. His card says Social Impact Evangelist, and I am excited to welcome Reverend Abram back to the State of Belief. Don, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for the incredible honor of being back. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you.
Oh my God. Don, I remember, we had a conversation about Pride in the Pew like early on. I don't want to say I don't know at what juncture, but I remember you telling me about this vision that you had when we were both at Interfaith America. And you had this amazing kind of vision, dream, almost like calling to start this organization that would intentionally bridge the LGBT community with the Black church, knowing that already within the Black church, there are so many LGBTQ people, and it's almost like surfacing the architecture underneath, and so congratulations, here we are. And I see you everywhere in social media and all the wonderful speaking engagements, and you're just making a profound difference. And so congratulations and happy Pride. Let me say happy Pride to you. And tell me how you're feeling right now.
I'm feeling thrilled, over the moon. I am processing. Pride in the Pews has grown tremendously, and in many ways, it's happening faster than I can process. Right. And it's moments like Pride where folk are interested in being in conversation with you and about the work, where you're able to take a step back and reflect on the journey. We've been around for 3 years now doing the work of Pride in the Pews. And you're right, Paul, when we met, all I had was sort of righteous rage and holy hope. And
Ooh, let's say that again. Righteous Rage and Holy Hope. That's the name of the show. All right. Yes. Yes.
that's all I
Okay.
had, and this big grand vision that the Black church could be more inclusive and more big-hearted than it already was. And I believe that all we needed to do was provide churches and faith leaders with culturally competent tools and resources and a network so that they might be able to be allies for LGBTQ plus communities, not just in the pew and in the pulpit, but also in the public square. And
Right.
so we started, as you know, Paul, with a storytelling project called Can I Get a Witness? We
Right.
collected 66 Black LGBTQ plus Christian stories from across the country, and we hired qualitative researchers who helped us take a deep dive into those stories. And that really enabled us to be able to create some cool, relevant, timely theoretical models and frameworks that we now use to train churches across the country. And that was our beginning. It was rooted in the stories and lived experiences of LGBTQ plus people of faith. And that's what has kept us going.
I mean, I love that so much for so many reasons, but one of them is because, like, can I get a witness? It starts with the foundations of the faith, which is witnessing to the truth that you hold in your body
Yes.
and letting all the analysis and the kind of strategies flow from that. And I think that really shows the kind of intentionality that you're bringing to this, but also kind of your own story. I mean, I think your own story is so captivating, and I'm not sure all of our listeners know about it. I wonder if you can take us back to your beginning, to your 14-year-old self, or maybe even a little bit before that, and kind of that moment of your own "Can I get a witness?" and how that began the journey that we're still on today, but that has reached this stage.
Oh, I'm happy to share. So I like to say all the time that I grew up in a hand clapping, toe tapping black church on the south side of Chicago. My Jamaican patois speaking grandmother would drag me to church every Sunday. And Paul, I hated it. I hated it. I would come up with all sorts of excuses like not being able to find matching socks or the right tie, all to no avail.
Wait, 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 wait. And you're saying you're gay? Those sound like
Right,
the gayest
right,
excuses
right.
I've ever. How can I go to church? I don't have matching socks. I love that. Yeah, this is the best you can do. It's not a stomach ache. It's not anything.
How did they,
It's like my fashion is not correct.
how did they not know then? How did they not know then?
Good. Okay, sorry to
I love
disrail
it.
you, but
I
I thought
love
that was very
it.
funny. Yes, go keep
That's
going.
hilarious. I would use those excuses that I
Yep.
thought, right, were slyly concealing my queerness, but perhaps not as much as I thought. But my grandmother would drag me, and I loved participating in youth choir and the usher board and the junior deacon board. It was a place where I was able to really make home,
Mm,
and I was called to preach at the age of 14. And the way it happened was really phenomenal. And God quite literally spoke to me through my dreams.
mm,
And I fell asleep one day after getting home from school on a cold winter afternoon in Chicago, and I drifted asleep. And when I woke up, I was in the familiar place of my home sanctuary. At the time, Paul, I was a celestial being. No one could see me, but I could see them. And I walked into the sanctuary, and saints' familiar faces were praising and worshiping God. And I began to walk down that middle aisle, and I saw this distorted figure in the pulpit. This person was preaching and teaching, and the congregation was responding affirmatively. As I walked closer to the pulpit, I began to see that image clearer. And I discovered that it wasn't, as I thought, my pastor preaching, but it was me. And so
mm.
here I was watching myself preach in my home sanctuary. And that was the moment, Paul, wherein I accepted my call to preach, recognizing in that moment that God was calling me to preach a liberating gospel.
Mm. You know what I love about that story? So many things, but one of them is even before you talked about the dream, you talked about the way that the church gave you leadership roles. and they
Yes.
trusted you to say, okay, we need you to organize this. We recognize your leadership in this way, in this way, in this way. So even before the call to ministry, there was a way that the Black church, in a world that diminished Black bodies in so many other settings, saw leadership potential and gave it to you. And then to have this, this vision, this dream. And so at that time, you're 14 and you start preaching and
Yes.
people start responding.
Yes.
And so you weren't like the shy one in the corner who occasionally said, well, let me just say 2 words. You were preaching and people
Yes.
were responding. And this became a lot about your identity as a
Yes.
preacher. It's not like some of us who like go through seminary and then we go through ordination process and we're like, okay, well, let me discern my call. And you're like, forget that. Like I'm there, I'm ready. So,
Yes.
but in all of this, then there's a beginning also awareness of who you are as a sexual being, as a complete person. How did that intersect with this real clear sense of call?
Well, it was a complicated place to be. I found myself both betwixt and between the religious tradition that I called home. In some ways, I embodied the tradition in my preaching
Yeah.
disposition and approach. But in other ways, I didn't, because my faith tradition was not affirming or accepting of
Mm.
LGBTQ plus folks. And so there was always this tension, this paradox, this conundrum that I found myself in, and I wasn't sure how to reconcile it. And so, Paul, I was one way in public and another way in private,
Mm. Mm.
recognizing that in my faith tradition, I could not be both queer and called.
Right.
If I did embody those two things, I would not only lose my community, but Paul, I would lose the thing that I was taught to care most about, and that was my ministry.
Your ministry and also the people who really had brought you up.
Yes.
It's not a small thing. People who say, "Oh, just come out." Oh, you just got to shed all of that religion stuff. They are not speaking into a reality that many people, not just communities of color, but it is true in communities of color. Lots of the places where they felt most safe, confure
Yeah.
is in their religious setting, and you can't just throw that out easily. We can get into this, but in some ways, the queer community can be very quick to say, "Oh, get rid of all that," and
Yes.
dismiss all that is important as
Yeah.
well to the rest of you, and not allowing for a holistic approach. And so what was the process like for you as you began to realize, okay, I could actually bring my full self to all of this? Were there mentors along the way? Were there people you
Mhm.
met? Or were there things that you read? I mean, I'm just curious, like, who were some of your guides as you tried to reconcile this?
Oh, this is a great question, Paul. Here's what I will say. It took a while, right, for me to be able to live into the authentic truth of who I was. And for me, the journey began, as I like to say, in the dark.
Mm,
And that's not unlike the way the Black church began too,
mm,
recognizing that you can't always be yourself in public, but there is
right.
some private theological exploration that you might be able to undergo to serve your freedom and liberation. And so for me, that process began in the dark. I was exploring my sexuality in sort of weird and random places. I was finding space to meet other queer folk. And here's the thing, Paul, this was all happening in church, right? Let's be very
Mm,
clear. It's all happening in church. And I never said, I'm queer. Are you queer too? There was just a knowing, right? There was a
mm,
way that
mm.
queer and trans folk just saw one another. And we
Yes.
never named it. We never said this is who we are, but we saw one another in a way that folks around us didn't. And so I was able to sort of cultivate and build community and find safety with queer folk in the church without
Mm,
even naming and identifying ourselves as queer. And that was a really interesting aspect of my coming into myself story. But for me, the process began, I think, Paul, intellectually and theologically.
mm,
When you are born in the Black church, you learn about the ways in which Jesus cared deeply about justice, the way that the ministry of Jesus and the gospel is really about setting the captive free and clothing the naked and feeding the hungry. And so for me, the lens through which I adopted to get to a place where I could honor the truth of who I was one wherein God cared about justice and liberation and those on the margins. And
Mm,
there are so many thinkers who brought me to that place, but I would say chief among them is James Cone.
hmm
James Cone, Black liberation theology, really laid the groundwork for me to be able to see God as not only Black, but also as queer.
mm.
And
Did I
here's the
ever tell
beautiful
you about my interaction with Jim Cone? Because I studied
thing.
under
No,
him. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I do know that. I
I
do know
studied
that.
under him at Union, and actually, like he constantly was pushing me
Mm,
to write more about queer theology. And
mm,
my main paper for him was Black Queer Theology, where they meet, where and he
wow.
and part of my field study was going out and looking at Unity Fellowship, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Yes.
Unity
Yes.
Fellowship, a Black queer denomination, and he
Mm,
was fascinated. He was like, give me your paper. I don't know about that. I need to know about that because I said, do you know about these people? Because they use liberation theology in their
yes.
ritual. They talk about it. And so he was more than just an ally. He believed in it in his heart. It wasn't him, but he was very like, the great story about Jim Cone was that he would lecture about LGBT theology or queer theology or whatever, and he loved to tell the story of Stonewall, and just
Yes.
and to quote Marsha P. and say like, we're not effing taking this anymore, and he would just like say that full on to his
Yes.
theological students, many of them who are very, we were all like liberals or progressive, but like some of them would clutch the pearls, who is
Girl.
this? And this is Jim Cone. And so,
Yes.
I just want to like affirm how
Yes.
how much in the tradition of Jim Cone that you found Jim Cone, and that
Mm,
helped you through
mhm.
your own moment, because I think he would have,
Absolutely.
I know for a fact he would have been incredibly pleased by that.
That's heartening to hear. And I do believe that I am firmly planted in that long-standing
Yeah.
tradition of Black liberation theology. And for me, Cone was able to help me sort of put language to something I had
Hmm.
always felt. And
Yeah.
that's that God cared deeply about my own freedom and self-actualization and self-possession.
Yeah.
And when
Yeah.
I was able to see God as a God who cared about that, then as I began to shed the shackles of shame around my
Uh-huh.
sexuality, I was able to sort of fall into the arms of a God who celebrated my coming out, right? And my
Mm.
coming into self.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. So we're, here we are, and I remember, when you were first starting out, and you came to me, thinking about like, well, what can we do comms wise? So like, what's a
Yes.
strategy? And I went out on social media and just was talking about it with the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss, who's also just a towering figure, was like, who is this? I want to know about it. I want, and I'm sure there's been people like that who have, over the past 3 years, have you been building this, who have been like, okay, this is great. This is what I've been waiting for. Bring it in. Bring it in. This is what we need. And, really, important figures who, who really are seeing you
Yeah.
and really appreciating what you're bringing to the table. How has that been like overall? I think my guess is that not everyone in the Black church is saying hurrah, hurrah, but there have been really important, moments that have given you hope along the way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think Reverend Otis Moss is one of those figures, certainly. Of course, he's based on the South Side of Chicago.
Right,
So
right.
that has a particular resonance for me, where I would pass Otis Moss's church every day on my way to school,
Wow. Yeah.
right? And so to be able to consider him a comrade and co-conspirator in the work has been phenomenal. But then there are other folks like Reverend Brad Braxton, who's the
Uh huh.
president of
Sure.
Chicago Theological Seminary, a progressive theological institution that's also on the south side of Chicago, who has fully embraced our work and me,
Mm, yeah.
and I'm so grateful for that. And here's the other thing: they're the movers and shakers that I have been floored by in many ways by them just embracing our work and supporting the work. And I think it's worth noting them, but I also think it's worth naming those whose names we may never know,
Hmm.
right? Whose stories we may never know. As I said, Paul, I began with sort of righteous rage and holy hope because I was frustrated by the absence of the Black church as it relates to LGBTQ plus advocacy in the public square. And I just believed I had this funny feeling and sneaky suspicion that if we were to invite particular faith leaders in the murky middle to engage in critical theological reflection around LGBTQ plus identity, they'll accept that invitation. They'll
Mm,
accept it. Now, Paul,
mm,
this is an act of faith because currently 0 out of 8 historically Black Christian denominations affirm LGBTQ plus communities.
mm,
0 out of 8. And here I am thinking that if we extend the invitation, right, if we build it, they will come. And so we decided to launch programming called the Black Church Equality Fellowship, where we provide churches with $4,000 and curricular support and financial support to be able to launch LGBTQ plus affirming initiatives. And we only had enough funding, Paul, for 10 churches. 10
mm.
Black churches across the country. And this is the first time Pride in the Pews is a new organization. Some folks are asking, who is this organization? Who is this man named Reverend Don? And we said, hey, we want you to know this is available and we want to invite you in with us. We put that call out, Paul, and a month later, there were over 40 churches that applied, and we only had 10 spots.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So,
They answered the call.
yeah, absolutely. Up next, more with Reverend Don Abram of Pride in the Pews. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guest is Reverend Don Abram, founder and executive director of Pride in the Pews. We had a really wonderful, Anne-Marie Minga, who's talking about the women in the civil rights movement, and she used this term everydayness. Like everyday folks, I mentioned Otis because I thought it was a great moment, and because
Yes.
he's someone who I've always admired and consider a friend. But this everydayness of people, showing up and saying, you know what, it's time. Let's do this. And they are not the sung heroes, but they are the heroes.
Yes. Yes. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
it's the folks like Otis Moss and Reverend Brad Braxton and Bishop Yvette Flunder, right? It's
Right.
these folks who give people courage,
Yeah,
right, to be able to say yes.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Because if those folks are willing to take the risk, if they're willing to step out on faith, if they're willing to do the scary thing, the prophetic thing, perhaps I can too.
Yeah. And so one of the things that's interesting, just being around members of the Black church and how whenever you talk about like LGBT issues in the Black church, they're like, as you said, they've always been there. This is not importing anyone. This is just about letting people be truly who they are in the place that makes them feel completely whole in other ways. And I think that's a really important exercise that you're offering. But then what I'm also hearing and beginning to, feel from your work is this isn't just about within the sanctuary walls. It's
Yes,
about
Paul.
where do we go from here, and
Yes.
not, to Black institutions, but also into the public square writ large.
Yes.
How can we fully come fully into the public square as the Black church, really representing, liberation for people across the spectrum. So, that's a next step that it feels like you all are moving into.
It certainly is. And here's the thing, Paul, this is squarely in line with the Black religious tradition.
Of 100%.
We have always been in conversation with the public square, recognizing that our faith should compel us to act in moral and just ways to advance liberation and equity for everyone. And so, for Pride in the Pews, we see that as an important part of our work. Yes, we are working with churches to make them more affirming within the four walls of the church.
Yeah.
But let me be clear, Paul, affirmation is not the goal, advocacy is. If LGBTQ plus allyship stops at affirmation within the four walls of the church, we will be missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Because even as we are affirming LGBTQ plus communities within our sacred spaces, they are still under assault in the public square. And that is where the church, those of us who believe ourselves to be believers of Christ and sort of torchbearers for justice, should be stepping up and stepping in, much like Christ did when the woman was being stoned for adultery, much like Christ did when the crowd was ready to accuse that woman with the issue of blood of contaminating the sacred space. God steps in and says, no. If you want to get to them, you have to get through me first. And so God wasn't just preaching in the sanctuary. God was advocating in the public square. I think we've been called to do the same.
I love that. I love that. I was actually, when I looked at your website, I was like, affirmation is not the goal. What is he in the world is he talking about? He doesn't want affirmation. I'm going to say it, Don Abram is anti-affirmation. No, I know you don't mean that. I figured it was that. I figured, it's like the next thing. Right. And we are living in a time, Reverend, and I know you know this, and I'm just curious how you're feeling. I mean, Pride 2024, there's so much to be grateful for in some ways. Groups like yours, in fact, are a reason, to be grateful, because there are people can be moved in this direction and have been. But right now, I just really feel like we are in a moment where, there are concerted efforts out there, and they would really want us to recede, to diminish, to be scared, to be intimidated, and to get smaller. So I'm just, I'm curious how you're feeling, Pride 2024.
I am actually feeling relatively optimistic. You caught me at a good time, Paul.
Oh, good.
Because these things ebb and flow, right? I mean, we are living in challenging and quite difficult times, particularly as LGBTQ plus folk. But we know that white Christian supremacy has its eyes set on a number of targets, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
And so
for me, I actually am quite heartened in this moment because, as you can see, I am currently in my hotel room, and I am in Nashville, Tennessee. And I am here because Pride in the Pews launched a cohort program called Journey to Pride. And we invited a cohort of Black LGBTQ plus folk in Nashville to join us for 4 weeks as we unpack religious trauma and also cultivate tools of spiritual resilience and fortitude so that we might be able to live into the truth of who we are. And Paul, it has been incredible to see that even in the face of anti-LGBTQ plus attacks in a place like Tennessee. In Tennessee, there are LGBTQ plus folk who are gathering together to affirm one another, to love one another, to hold space for one another, and to heal even in the midst of attack.
Yeah, that is, you're absolutely right. It does. Are you familiar with the HBO show We're Here? Have you heard about this? With the drag, drag folks. They have a new cast this year, and they've been really located in Tennessee, which is kind of the in some ways the belly of the beast. And they've been like, you know what, we're gonna be here, and we're gonna show up, and we're gonna show the creativity of the artistry of drag. We're not gonna be hidden, and you can't make us ashamed. But it, it really does highlight the you kind of feel like, wow, this is to live with that day in, day out. But I'm so glad you're doing that. And that's what we need. We need people to know that they are not alone in this,
Yes.
that I think
Yeah.
that's it's such a through line for the work we're doing at Interfaith Alliance. It's the through line for all of the work is if you feel isolated, you feel powerless. If you feel
Yes.
connected and in collaboration and that you have a community, and the community can be really localized, but it can also be part of a broader movement. And I think that's so important about what you're doing. I, I'm I am interested in how there's like we've had guests who are from the trans community, and I'm curious, is there a how trans individuals are being received in the broader work that you're trying to do? I think sometimes like we're at a moment where like almost like the people who really decide that they want to hold on to hate, they're like, well, I'm
Yes.
not sure like two people who love each other is the place that's not a winning issue for us, but trans, we can really go after trans people, you know what I mean? And I'm just curious how that's playing in the black church context, but then in the broader context of your work.
Well, there is such misinformation and disinformation
Correct.
around trans communities. And unfortunately, the religious right has done a great job at making trans folks the boogeyman,
Right.
and demonizing and vilifying them. And I'm disheartened to see that in many ways, those narratives have taken root and taken
Yeah.
up in Black churches and in Black communities in ways that have sort of stifled the work. And so, even as we have been able to make movement around same gender loving people and queer
Right.
folks, and lesbians and gays, it almost feels as if the next frontier of the work is trans inclusion,
I
because the
agree.
conversations in faith communities around trans identities, non-binary identities are still burgeoning. I mean, folk are
Yeah.
still trying to find the language, still trying to understand and wrap their minds around gender fluidity. I mean, it's a difficult concept, right, for folks
Right.
to kind of wrap their heads around. And so even as folks are curious and interested, some of them are afraid, right,
Yes.
to engage the conversation. Some of them aren't willing to admit that they don't know what they don't know. And some folk, quite frankly, have internalized these sort of one-dimensional narratives around trans people to the point of degree that their hate is really wrapped around false narratives, right?
Yeah.
And so I actually realize that in my work and in my experience, when I have these conversations, particularly with Black Christians in the mainstream church, it's not that they hate trans people, it's that they don't understand, right?
Yes.
Transness
Yes.
or trans identities. And
Right.
there are people who would seek to capitalize on that confusion and that misinformation so that they might be able to advance their own problematic and insidious agenda.
I think that that's exactly right. It's really a call that we can't let there be a vacuum there,
Yeah.
and there has to. And again, it goes back to especially when you're dealing with the church. It's like you can't make it devoid of theological exploration. Let's have the conversation, like God made man and woman and la, 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 la. And then and it was interesting. We had a trans as I mentioned a trans minister who was like, well, both. God made both to reflect God's image. And so, like, what he started doing some some interesting theological work, and I was like, okay, like this is what we need more of. The ability to have these kind of conversations, I think, are just are really really important. And so, listen, I'm really excited. What's a new project that you're just really like on fire about that you want to make sure our listeners hear about? That maybe, and prideinthepews.com, people can find out more there. But what's something that you are like, okay, we're meeting the moment here with this new project that we're engaged in?
I am so thrilled to say that this coming fall, Pride of the Pews will be launching a cohort focused on the South, the
Mm.
entire southern region of the United States, to tackle HIV and AIDS. As we know, HIV is an ongoing epidemic. It is disproportionately impacting Black communities and LGBTQ plus communities. And sadly, the epidemic has continued in large part because of problematic theologies around
Mm.
queer people and
Mm.
trans people and sexuality broadly speaking. And
Right.
so Pride in the Pews decided to put its voice and expertise toward tackling this particular issue. And so we will be inviting faith leaders from across the South to take this issue on and provide them with resources so that they might be able to help us decrease the number of folks acquiring HIV in the South and have critical conversations to destigmatize conversations around HIV in the Black church and in Black communities, broadly speaking.
This is hugely important. When the time comes, let me know, because we would love to spread the word
Yes,
about that on social media in whatever ways we can. I think that sounds
absolutely.
like a critical work. One of the things that just is disturbing to me is within some of the kind of prosperity gospel churches, and in some of the the more of the kind of charismatic Pentecostal, there is like a certain, almost a sneaking embrace of this kind of Christian nationalism. We are seeing that, and almost buying into this worldview that really was not was not birthed for them, but they
Mhm.
are taking it on. And so I'm just curious, have you run into any of this, like in your work, really working with the Black church writ large? But the Black church is not a monolith. There are so many
It's not.
things going on in that,
Yes,
and I think we have this, I think there's an idealized version of the Black church, but then
that's
there's
right.
the reality on the ground of
Yes,
all kinds of different Black churches.
yes,
And I'm specifically concerned, I mean, there's ways to do prosperity gospel light, which I have less, but there's some that are just really hardcore, like, and it goes into HIV theology,
yes,
like, God punishes those who,
yes,
and if you're
yes,
poor, well, obviously you're sinning too much. I mean, there's ways that the gospels are turned on its head with prosperity
yes,
gospel. The white
yes.
church, infamous for this, but unfortunately the Black church has some of that influence. I'm just curious how your outreach has gone within those broader communities.
Yeah. And so I think the important thing to name and note is that you don't have to be white to practice white Christian nationalism,
That is
right?
so important that you're saying that, Don, because it's actually something that is absolutely true. You see it in Hispanic churches, you see it in
Yes,
Black churches,
yes,
and believe me, the white Christian nationalists like nothing more to be able to point to these
yes,
churches and say, look, no, no,
yes,
no. No, no,
yes,
no. We're like, we're as, we're multiracial. You're not.
that's
You have
right.
an idea of who really counts. And,
Yes,
and so like, I really appreciate you saying that, because it's something that people need to remember.
yes, yes. And as a result, right, there are theologies that can be preached and proclaimed that are fundamentally rooted in the pursuit of power
Yeah.
and the exclusion of those whom we see as other. And it's the theology of otherization, right, that fundamentally undergirds Christian nationalism,
Right.
where
That's
there
right.
are clear and crystallized ideas of whose stories matter, whose lives matter, right, what communities matter. And if you fall outside of that narrow window, right, and it is narrow, let me be very clear, then you are a target. But the insidious thing about Christian nationalism is that it will use anyone willing to proclaim and project that ideology. And so you can be Black, you can be queer, you can be trans, you can be Hispanic, you can be white. Anyone who's willing to preach that message, right, they will be elevated, right, in Christian nationalist circles. And so I have seen the ways in which the Black church and the Black religious tradition has been co-opted by Christian nationalism, and with the promise of power.
Right.
If
That's
you
right.
join us, you will get cultural power. You will get political power. You will be in circles that give you influence. All right.
You'll be
And
able
there,
to lay your hands on a certain candidate and
yes,
proclaim him God's anointed. I mean,
yes,
you'll be that close to power.
that close to, and it's the seductive
Right.
sort of nature of power that I think has deluded many folk who are in the Black religious tradition to adopting
Mm.
that sort of theological position. And so we have had to confront it in our own tradition. We have had to push back and challenge and critique, recognizing that Christian nationalism is anathema to all that the Black church is. It's fundamentally against the very ethos of what we know the Black church to be. And so we have been preaching it and teaching it and equipping folk in our network to push back against it, recognizing, let's be clear that homophobia and transphobia is a byproduct of Christian nationalism, is a byproduct of
100%.
colonial
100%.
legacy.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
And so
100%.
tying that thread together for folks that so
Mm.
that they might be able to see
Mm.
this is not new. We've
Right.
seen this before.
Oh, no. I mean,
It has laid
this is,
around like a sort of loaded weapon, right? That
yeah,
is now
right. Oh.
being sort of leveraged
Mm.
and used against those on the margins.
Oh, wow. Great. Thank you so much. Listen, this is so much fun to talk to you about. We're not going to be able to go on
No,
for
Paul, it's
with
my
the
pleasure.
5 hours, the 5 hours that we would probably like to, but I'm not sure our listeners can hang on for that long. So, I love to end this show with, inviting guests to just talk about what's giving you hope right now for this moment.
Oh, that's such a great question. I would argue that the thing that's giving me hope right now is community. Uh, I have found that when I am at my lowest, when I am dejected and depressed by the state of the world around me, I am able to gather around the communities that Pride in the Pews has been privileged to create, and find comrades and co-conspirators who are able to hold hope when I have none, who are able to encourage me when I feel discouraged. And so in these moments, I am finding hope in community, whether that's community in Nashville, right, through Journey to Pride, whether that's community through the Black Church Equality Fellowship, or that's community through incredible platforms like this, where you realize that you are not alone, you are not fighting this fight by yourself, and that there is a brighter side on the other side of this. And so I think that's the thing that has given me hope and given me courage in the midst of being under such tumultuous and perilous times.
Reverend Don Abram is founder and executive director of Pride in the Pews, a nonprofit working to bridge the gap between the Black church and the LGBTQ community nationwide. Learn more at prideinthepews.com. And as you know, we are also working with a collective of folks on Faith for Pride 2024, and we would encourage you to go to faithforpridealso.org and learn more about how you can participate in that. Don, thank you so much for being part of the State of Belief. I am so grateful for you and all your work, and happy Pride to you.
Happy Pride to you. Thank you so much again, Paul, for having me on.
So this week, right before we started recording this show, the verdict came down in the Hunter Biden case, which I just want to say, especially to those of our listeners who may also have a history and continue to have the presence of addiction in your life, as I do. I just want to send you a moment of support and recognition that this may be difficult for some people to process. At the same time, I do want to lean into some of the beauty of the moment, which is that Hunter Biden never denied that he had an addiction, and he also never, kind of tried to say anything aside from, he's just so grateful that he is sober today. And I think that for those of us who also experience addiction, that's a really important message. And I just want to extend Hunter Biden and all of us who are have addiction as part of what we experience in this life, that to make sure that get what you need right now, if that's going to a meeting, if that's being surrounded by love, but know that you are loved, and that you are cared for, and that your life is very sacred in my belief, in God's eyes, and in the people around you. So take care of yourself. I'm very encouraged by the way President Biden, this isn't a political statement, this is just around family, has just, throughout the whole thing said, I love my son, and Joe Biden as well. And I just think that that's such an example for those of us who are parents and those of us who are friends, relatives to people who do have addiction, to love them. Be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platforms, or at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of this show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook and Instagram at State of Belief. That's the handle, at State of Belief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.